Hi, folks, and thanks for joining us here at SomeFuture for episode 25 of our podcast. We are your hosts, Jack and Chris.
Hey.
What's up, man?
Hey.
So, guys, today we've got some pretty interesting topics like usual. On Present Futures, we'll be discussing the future of fuel and elder retirement in the next recession. On Paleo Futures, we'll be discussing past world government and the future of world government. And on FizBiz, we'll be discussing robot companies. As always, we hope that you enjoy our show, and please visit our website and blog where we post our supporting materials at www.somefuture.org. Follow us on our Twitter handle at SomeFuture, or visit us on our Facebook page, or simply connect with us on LinkedIn or Facebook. We always welcome your engagement with questions, concerns, or ideas of things you would like to hear about on our podcast by emailing us at somefuturepodcast@gmail.com or by engaging with us on social media. Now let's see what the future has in store for us in SomeFuture.
That's SomeFuture.
Chris, I wanted to start my section off about something that has been in the news a lot recently.
Okay.
And that's, of course, something that you know, electric vehicles and renewable energy. It seems every day there's something in the news about solar power or whatever, all these things.
Elon Musk got to get off Twitter, man. He's got to get off Twitter, man. Seriously.
It's something that we've talked about on the show a lot before, too. However, I'm pretty sure you know this, but our listeners may not. So you know that when Toyota started producing the Toyota Prius and yuppies everywhere started stating how green they were with their vehicles, personally, I got kind of fed up because what these people didn't realize is that with so-called green technologies, it still takes a huge amount of carbon to make these items. And electric vehicles aren't green for green's sake. And in fact, there's a lot of electricity that powers them that may in fact be coming from fossil fuel burning plants, those coal powered plants. So it actually, one thing that I want to talk about today in the future of fuel is that I want to talk about how it takes more fossil fuels to create an electric vehicle than a regular fossil fuel burning vehicle. I've talked about some of the positives, some of the negatives, and then what the future of fuel may be as far as it comes to our vehicles or modes of transportation. So obviously, there's the rare earth materials that are in our phones and our computers, everything like that. But they're actually also in a Tesla or any other type of electric car. And they actually amount for a lot of environmental damage. For example, if you take a Chinese mine that mines for these materials, it actually I saw a video where they dig 8-foot holes, just out of the ground. And then they take all of the dirt from those holes and then they add chemicals, allowing them to extract the rare earth minerals. Well, about 0.02% of what they find is those rare earth minerals. So it takes a lot of digging and a lot of ground they have to basically mess up by adding these chemicals to find these rare earth minerals. And then what they do with that is they just put it back in the ground. So, there's a lot of contaminated soil that's going back. So one good thing is that they're trying to find ways to recycle batteries and things like that are found in all of these devices, including electric cars. But they still haven't really found the best way to do that. But, I guess it's kind of a misconception that people believe that they're going to landfills, where actually they haven't been going to landfills in decades unless you just throw away your phone in the trash can or something like that. That's very rare for that to happen. So my question then, if these electric cars aren't actually as green as we think they are, what is the future of fuel? Well, after doing a lot of research, a lot of things that I've found that a lot of other people are doing when it comes to fuel, hydrogen is something that I wanted to bring up today because it seems to be not necessarily so much in the Western world, but on the Eastern world, they seem to be really getting on board with hydrogen. So hydrogen is one of the most common elements in the universe. It produces no carbon emissions when it's burned, and it has double the energy density of fossil fuels. Japan is one of those countries that has gone all in on hydrogen cars, along with a lot of Asian countries that are jumping on board as well. And Japan intends to use the 2020 Tokyo Olympics to showcase the technology, thousands of hydrogen fuel cell vehicles, a network of filling stations, and a hydrogen-powered athletes village. So Japanese car makers are selling hydrogen fuel cell vehicles, and Toyota is building a plant to manufacture these fuel cell stacks. Japanese homes are being equipped with fuel cell technology to provide electricity, and plants are being built to make hydrogen using renewable energy. The country also imports hydrogen believe it or not, coming mostly from Australia, which seems to be the front runner because actually what it does is it takes its plentiful coal supplies and it makes hydrogen, but then captures the resulting carbon dioxide emissions. So it's using fossil fuels to create fuels to power our vehicles and everything like that. What's nice about that, though, is that they're not releasing those harmful CO2, that CO2 into the atmosphere. They're capturing it and they're storing it underground most of the time. I really like hydrogen. It can be produced like in all manners of ways. There are dozens of projects out there in the works to produce it from as simple as using the sun's energy to separate it from water to capturing it from normal industrial processes that create it. There's actually already several factories that create hydrogen and they use it for their own purposes. Like they use it to create other things. So it's a byproduct of what they're creating, and then they just use it to power like a furnace or something like that, which is pretty interesting. It actually can be mixed with natural gas. So even though right now hydrogen is still very difficult to transport, it's very difficult to really get it into to all these different things. There's different elements that I'll go into in a second about why it's so bad, but it can actually be mixed with natural gas, which could bring down carbon emissions quicker while they find ways to make it and distribute it, because those are the two things that are the hardest part of hydrogen production right now. So believe it or not, the bulk of hydrogen is made today by steam reforming methane, but it has to be combined with carbon capture and storage, which what they're doing in Australia, in order for it to be truly emissions free. However, carbon dioxide emissions are still estimated to be 25 to 30% lower than with diesel, even when they do it in this way. It's not the final picture, but a good, intermediary would be Pierre-Etienne Franck, who's the vice president of advanced business and technology at Air Liquide, which told Chemistry World, an article that I read over this, and we'll be posting that online, is that they think that what they're doing is basically launching a hydrogen council to make hydrogen a real possibility for the rest of the world. It's produced in many different types of ways, but obviously, like I said, the hardest things for hydrogen production are that it's highly flammable, which is dangerous, and it's hard to distribute because basically what they have to do is it's not very dense. So if you're transporting it in like what we consider traditional fuel transportation vehicles, like trucks and things like that, you have to make it dense before you can transport it, and then you have to separate it and then put it in, and then be able to basically make it into fuel. Obviously, that is one thing that I think about when I think about the future of fuel. It's probably one of our best opportunities when it comes to producing fuel that you can, basically have to build a network and things like that, but you can mix it with natural gas and fuel your vehicles, things like that. It's better on engines and things like that. But then obviously we still have fossil fuels. They're plentiful. We have a system set up. Most of the vehicles on the road are already using it. Obviously, the cons are that it's bad for the environment and it's controlled by special interests. Everybody knows OPEC and the fact that, oil can be artificially inflated or deflated depending on their whims. And the United States had an issue with that in the 1970s when we ticked off a bunch of countries and our oil prices shot up to the roof. Another option is ethanol, but I'm on the fence about ethanol because basically right now we're in a period of rapid human growth where we are going to continue to need spaces to grow food for our own consumption. So to be able to grow oil or grow your own fuel, while it sounds nice and it sounds sustainable, it displaces those crops for food, and it also takes a lot of water for ethanol. They estimate that it takes 8 gallons of water for every gallon of fuel produced. So that's quite a lot. Obviously, you have like corn, canes, grasses, those types of things are ethanol. And finally, gets me to my point about electricity. So you and I have talked a lot about different types of electricity when it comes to, whether it be, fission, nuclear fusion, different types of ways of power generation outside of traditional fossil fuels. We're looking at, solar power, et cetera, et cetera. In actuality, right now, most of electricity is actually being created from coal burning and fossil fuel power plants or nuclear power plants, which then produce nuclear waste, which we have nowhere to put. Right now, the issue with electric vehicles is that if they are getting powered this way, they still have a carbon footprint, even if they're claiming not to, because of how it's getting powered. Still, it's better than a car that takes gasoline, because it takes they estimate about half of what a traditional car is, how many emissions that a electric car is generating. So it is a step in the right direction. But Chris, I mean, tell me your thoughts on all this. I mean, what other fuels have you thought of? Have you heard of? Do you want to comment on any of this?
Yeah, well, I mean, geez, there's a lot to talk about.
Yeah, I know.
You know, for one, this goes back to one of our first conversations that we had with Futurist Gary Golden on energy. And remember, Gary had told us that, when we talk about the green revolution, we just cannot forget about all the other fuels that power everything, right? So just as you rightly said, the future of fuels is not just all solar or all tidal or all whatever else we want to call alternative/green fuels. We're still going to have coal. We're still going to have natural gas, and they're going to have to be a part of the mix. And we're just going to have to do it more efficiently. And I think what was really interesting about hydrogen, and really just the creation of it, is the fact that you can use the worst part of natural gas, which, by the way, we have a glut of natural gas. Right now, the United States is the number one natural gas producer in the world. I think we're creeping up. If we haven't already surpassed, we're the largest oil producer in the world, and that's due to hydraulic fracturing. And while there's been a lot of pushback and problems when it comes to hydraulic fracturing, it allowed us to be energy independent and to be flush with oil and natural gas. So, if I could just say, I think natural gas is more palatable to the greenies out there that want to make sure, and I'm sort of one of them too. But you and we're going to have to not only play as devil's advocate, but we're going to have to play with the devil a little bit. We're going to have to use these fossil fuels, these hydrocarbon fuels, to help drive our stuff. And if we can use the byproduct of natural gas in order to create another fuel source, I think that's fantastic, right? It just makes a lot of sense. When we're always trying to recycle and reuse and ensure that we can use every piece of energy that we can to power civilization going further. I think the issue, and you touched on a little bit, is how do you create an infrastructure system in order to propel hydrogen use or electric car use or all these other new ways? And those are going to create other problems. Remember, the electric car, I think it preceded gasoline-powered engines, but it was because of the ease of the ability to make gasoline, the ability to create an infrastructure of gasoline systems that allowed people to slowly move towards the gasoline-powered vehicles. And I think that cannot be overstated. And of course, the all the money that these oil companies were making at the time allowed them to invest into this infrastructure. I think the infrastructure of a hydrogen-based car system, as well as the infrastructure of an electric-based car system, is going to give people pause, right? Because, well, who's going to install the infrastructure for the electric base? Is it going to be the states who are creating, helping to create the electrical infrastructure? Is it going to be the companies themselves? Is it going to be Tesla or some of the other electric companies that are coming along? Even as Toyota and or Ford or some of those companies continue to create more electric vehicles, how does that work? And now you're going to complicate that even more because you're giving us another fuel source, right? I mean, I know in South America, they're heavy on natural gas. That's another source we can do. I know that NGVs, that's what they're called, natural gas vehicles. There's been an increase for natural gas vehicle usage, definitely in the military, but also across the United States. So you have these areas that use natural gas vehicles for maybe city fleet buses. I know there was a lot of NGV investment when it came to UPS and some of these other places where they have sort of a hub so they can fill up. But what it just means is that all of this stuff gets really complicated when it comes to distribution. People love to just plug in their own personal car all day from their garage. I don't have a garage. So I don't know how I'd even be able to have my own electric vehicle if I had no choice, because I don't have one. I don't know how I'd be able to get that thing plugged in. So there's a lot of issues to sort of break down and go through. And of course, us being futurists, we're the ones that have to say, hey, wait, stop. What are the implications of putting these other fuel sources in and using them? So I think it's something that everyone should give pause to. By the way, I don't think that, hey, let's just forget about it and forget about hydrogen. Let's forget about electrical because it's too hard, and let's just go ahead and get in our big semi trucks and and Mad Max it up. but like we have to think about how to create the infrastructure to help drive this stuff and be able to have what I would consider to be a complete and desirable mix that's not going to hurt the environment excessively, and just work that as best we can.
Yeah. Well, so I guess my last question for you. So if I'm looking at hydrogen and I'm looking at electric, what do you think is the future of fuel? Or you said that because you think there's just so many hybrids that it's going to be a mixture. I mean, maybe could you see a future of no, electrical grid? Maybe like we all have our own power sources in our house that's powered by solar. And then that's where hydrogen comes in. And maybe hydrogen is the traditional, go to the fuel pump and, pump it into your car. Is that what you see as the future of the fuel?
Well, there's multiple things that we're talking about. And this is, again, going back to Gary's original. I think we should listen to that, maybe get him on again to kind of talk with us. But one thing that he talked about was personal energy. And personal energy was going to be a sort of future trend that we're going to be looking into. So, having our own natural gas cells inside of our house, or having a Tesla battery, or different types of batteries that can help not only drive our vehicle, but drive our house in a multitude of different ways. So I think we're just at the beginning of just speaking on personalized energy at the household, and of course how that is distributed to all the other places. And I think the harder question is beyond the personal, because that's sort of consumer based. It's something that I can control. It's harder when it comes to large scale infrastructure reestablishment, right? It took years to establish the telephone lines, the copper wire. Now they're going to have to go and replace it with fiber optics for the communications. We have a nationwide network of gasoline systems that work. People propel via gasoline, and there's refineries based in certain areas. And, even when there's a hurricane, it affects them, but it works to some extent. And now we're going to have to create a whole new infrastructure, nationwide connection points for electric vehicles. And it all has to interoperate with everything else. I mean, this is a truly mammoth undertaking. And, this is hot on the heels of what's going to be a lot of deficits for places like the United States. There's not a lot of hunger for investment in other places besides maybe China investing in the Middle East and Africa. So you've got governments sort of having their purse strings tightened around an ever perilous world, and you have I think you have some trouble with how are we going to recreate this. To me, I think this is an investment for the future. If anything, I've been thinking about this. I think we need to, as citizens, global citizens, think about proper taxation so we can actually make these big aggressive moves. And a big aggressive moves would be changing the infrastructure to help drive other types of fuel like electric, like hydrogen, like natural gas. And maybe there is a regional play here. So maybe because there's a glut of natural gas in, let's say, Brazil or Qatar, that's going to be a place where natural gas makes sense, and you can create infrastructure systems around that. And then maybe perhaps in other places that are having electric lines, or it's easier for electric lines, they're sort of electric powered. And obviously there's going to be a mix with all of them therein. But I think we have to be smart about it. And I think we have to see that as global citizens, we're going to need to invest in these sorts of infrastructure so we can propel and continue to have enough energy to manage society. So for my present futures today, I wanted to get a little personal, Jack, and talk a little bit anyway about what I see even happening in my own family. And I'd like to get your thoughts too, because, both you and I are in our 30s. Our parents are getting a little bit older. And I've been hearing a lot of, real negative talks about the older Americans and the trouble that they're having. And when I was talking about getting personal, my own family, we have some people who have run into some troubles, financial troubles, not of their fault. It's just that society sort of has moved, and in order to have, in order to be a middle class person, I think nowadays it's mandatory to have a college degree, and it's probably even more mandatory to have a master's and or PhD, right? It's the information economy. You have to stay, lockstep with everything of the day. And yesterday's salesperson is tomorrow's data scientist. So it's a troubling thing for sure. So let's talk a little bit about the present futures, right? That I uncovered, and then I'll talk a little bit about sort of the personal, and then we'll just discuss it and I'll just see what you think. But so I've been just seeing a grip of articles about the troubling signs of older American bankruptcies. So at more than double the rate in just 25 years, there has been a grip of elderly bankruptcy happening. So people 65 years or older grew 204% into bankruptcy from 1991 to 2006. And the percentage of seniors among all U.S. bankruptcy filers increased by nearly 5 times over the same period. So the economic burden of aging also, and I took a look at some sort of futurist forecast, and what they see is that the association with cost is really the biggest culprit that we have here. Costs simply are just going up. So in previous generations, what was needed was 12% of the income that came in for senior citizens was needed. Now it's 20, and it's been sort of inching up every year. And Americans are less likely now than ever to have to retire with a private pension. Given the popularity of the 401ks that started in the 70s and 80s, where workers were primarily responsible for their own investments and their savings versus the pension systems of before. Simply put, Americans just did not save enough. And when it comes to rising inflation, they are going to more and more debt. And this is turning into a really big problem. So just between 2015 and 2030, the number of the people in the world 60 or over is going to grow by 56%. So from over 900 million to 1.5 billion. By 2050, the global population older than 60 is expected to jump to 2 billion. So what that means is that we're going to double the amount of people in the United States by 2060 from 50 million to 100 million of people over 65. So this is a major problem because what's the issues at hand when you're older? Well, obviously, healthcare costs, right? That's a gigantic problem. And as you and I are aware, there's an issue when it comes to paying for healthcare in general. It's one of the largest costs for all Americans. And so it's troubling because we have a Medicare system that is the biggest driver of American debt in the United States. And you're going to have more and more of these folks with more and more problems. And obviously, they will not be able to bear the brunt of out-of-pocket healthcare costs. And, on top of that, a lot of them, they just can't even afford to pay the bills. Right. So, and this is beyond just the United States. So Central America and South America are also rapidly aging. The proportion of people over 60 is increasing significantly in Central America, South America, and the Caribbean as well. In Greece, Spain, and Italy, and Portugal, the governments have had to reform pension systems. So this is things like increasing the retirement age and limiting the amount of benefits and reducing resources. And then also the populous Asian countries like China and India, there are even greater challenges because they have just a bunch of older people. So they're a little bit different than us in Europe and especially actually us in the United States. We're actually centered a little bit better because our demographics are a little bit better. So the population of people over 65 in 30 years in China, for instance, will be 25%. One out of every 4 people will be over 65, coming into 2045. So, what does this mean, right? What's going to happen? So, what people see is that, there are four things that are going to need to happen in order to get us through this hump of having this glut of people over 65. One, you want to make sure that society develops some sort of payment and insurance system, long-term care, that is good and better than the existing ones. Two, you're going to want to take advantage of the medicinal and behavioral health sort of technologies to keep everyone healthy and, of course, active as possible. So you're talking preventive medicine as well as new types of, whether it's pharmaceuticals / biotechnologies that can help drive better health results. Three, changing the way that society maybe organize community services so that care is more accessible inside the community. And of course, altering the cultural view of aging to ensure that all ages are integrated into the fabric of community life. So, I think we can't, there's some really good answers there. There's no humanity though, when it comes to this. And this is where I wanted to talk a little bit about, my personal life. So, as I said, I have this same problem happening inside of my family, where I have some folks that, they're getting older, the late 50s, mid 60s, no college educations, and my family has had to come together and had to live together in order to help sustain them and to keep them going. Now, of course, I'm here to help. Unfortunately, I don't live in the same state. We don't live in the same city, so it's sort of harder for me to interject myself in their lives. But I think, my family, the microcosm of my own family is something that may be a norm. So when we think of the nuclear families of yesteryear, where the grandmother and the aunt and the uncle and the cousins, they live in the big house and it's a big familiar setting, that may be something in the future that we may see more often is, these bigger families, not because they want to, but because they have to. I wouldn't even be surprised if there would be less, old folks' homes, right? Because there might not even be enough money for these folks to continue to propel. So I think this is this is something that it's not sexy, and it's not a sexy futurist sort of project to take on for sure. But to me it's extremely important. And I think and I'll finish up here with the second part of this, because on top of these issues that we see when it comes to the the elderly, we have a business cycle which may end very soon, right? We're flying high in the economy in the United States, and I think the world is benefiting from us, and I think that's fine. We just did a major tax cut, and we're increasing our debt levels higher than ever, and this puts us in a precarious position, because if we go into another recession, there's nothing left to do other than to cut the very benefits that these retirees need at this time. And whether it's an oversaturation, increased inflation, the too much corporate debt, there's a lot of things that could cause our next recession, the end of the business cycle, to cause major economic issues, not only in America, but of course externally to the world. And I think this is something that we need to think about in the next couple of years of how do we not only manage to keep the economy going, but how we keep the economy going without getting rid of these social safety nets that are going to impact these folks who are in their late 50s, getting to the 60s and 70s, to ensure that they can have a viable and capable life. So I don't mean to be a bummer, but every now and again we got to be serious, and we got to think about how we can better people around us. So I just want to know what are your thoughts about all this stuff?
Yeah, Chris, I completely agree with you. I think that, one reason we didn't create this podcast to be solely focused on technology. We are futurists. We are social scientists. We are people who look at all of these different things and we question about the future. We look at strategic foresight and we try to bring that scientific aspect to this. But obviously, we can only speak from experience when it comes to our own personal lives and things that have happened to others or things that we've read and things like that. So this is something that is truly something that is a major issue in our country, and like you've noted, not in other countries as well. And this is affecting all of us. and we have to come up with solutions to very real issues. That's what's happening with the pace of technology right now, is that it's enabling us to do so much more, but wealth is being concentrated more and more in the hands of the fewer and fewer people. And there are people out there, the middle class is disappearing. There's tons of studies that say that. And now we have to figure out, well, how do we take care of the people that are here? How do we limit the amount of people that are continuing to grow? But then how do we make sure that people aren't left behind? Because if you look at as a historian, I look at the past to understand the future. And over time, many times, people have lost their livelihoods. They've lost their lives. They've been thrown on the streets because of the pace and change of technology, but also in the pace and change of society. So that is something that we need. Hopefully, whoever our next elected leader is, you know, you and I try to avoid politics, but whoever they are, or if it's the same person, they need to examine this, and we need to find real solutions to these problems, because they're only going to continue to grow.
Yeah, no, absolutely, man. And I think we need to start pulling these stories out of and putting them front and center of the media. And it's hard to watch. I was just watching an article, or excuse me, a video yesterday by Vice, and it was this woman who lived in San Francisco. You know, this is one of those places where it's really hard to live, one of the most expensive places in the United States. And this poor woman, you know, lost her job, doesn't have college education, can't get the train. You know, she's in school, working 3 jobs, and lives in her car with her daughter. And this is somebody she's not looking for a handout. She's in school to better herself, but this is her reality. And I think we need to look deeper into that. We need to take a harder look at how we can better the lives of ourselves and those around us by investing our tax dollars properly, and by ensuring that we're not wasting ourselves on silly wars, because the crisis is not outside of the United States that worries me. It's the internal crises, and it's actually this familiar crisis, the crisis of family, you know, and how to work and how to change our society to view, you know, living in families and being able to come together under one roof as something that is actually, you know, a positive notion here. So I think it may just be shifting back to what it was, you know, around the 1920s and 30s when people did band together. So I think it's just something to pay attention to as we move forward.
Well, and I want to leave one more thing on the table here, is that not everybody needs a college education. That's one thing that, you know, you and I have talked about a lot. And, you know, a college education only gives you the high level theory. I mean, you talk to any PhD, I'm an educator, you know that. You talk to any PhD and they'll tell you that, you know, when they were getting their PhD, it's a racket. You know, they have to basically be indentured servants to other PhDs while they're getting their PhD to then hopefully get to that point so you can educate people. And I can tell you, I'm now having, you know, 4 college degrees myself, that, you know, they don't teach you the stuff necessarily you need in a working environment. You know, there are technical degrees out there. There are other things out there that people can do and have done very, very well. Look at some of our, you know, greatest billionaires or whatever. You know, Mark Zuckerberg didn't get a college degree. Bill Gates didn't get a college degree. What you need knowledge. And what we need to do is pass that knowledge on to other people and train them. Canada itself said, hey, you know, we're going to retrain people so that we can stop the AI revolution, you know, from, you know, in its tracks, so people don't just lose their jobs and then we're stuck with this huge amount of population who can't do anything. That's what we need to be doing, and we're not doing it. And that, you know, and I'm not saying let's create a social welfare state. I'm saying what we need to do is we need to invest in our people, and then they will pay back in dividends what we put into them. Okay, Chris, for Paleo Futures today, I wanted to bring up a concept that has existed for thousands of years, one in which people have strived for, either through violent means or through peaceful means, and that is the concept of a world government. The idea that one governing body can exist over wide swaths of people and determine fiscal policy, separation of church and state, establish a Bill of Rights for their citizens, and work together in mutual defense. All of that is something that I want to talk about today. So I'm going to try to go through it as quickly as possible so we can have time to actually talk about it. So let's go into the fact that, you know, we've had a number of empires throughout the world, you know, over the millennia, from the Roman Empire to the Mongolian Empire, the British Empire. All of these actually only sought to bring populations of people under the rule of one government. And those people didn't normally have to say anything. They didn't have any say in, how they were governed. They were conquered peoples. And it's only been in modern memory, and when I say modern, I mean the last couple of centuries to really the last century or so, where institutionalized bodies have been created in attempts to govern diverse populations of people, encouraging a democratic way of coming to decisions. Because let's face it, Chris, no one wants to give up power over their own decisions. Therefore, I wanted to take a look at 4 governing bodies, 2 of which are regional governing bodies and 2 of which are international bodies, to see where we have been and to understand where we're going, which is the purpose of Paleo Futures, to really, get us to think about the future from learning from the past. So the first body that I'm coming up with, which I know everybody, most of our listeners are familiar with, is the United States of America. So the fact that it's a country that was created with individual states making their own laws and maintaining their own police force and so much more has served as the foundation for democratic movements all over the world. Whether or not you agree or disagree with the United States policy, that's separate. But from the ideals of the French Revolution to democratic movements all over the world, the United States has been an influencer. And, it's composed of 50 different states all working together to set policies for the diverse populations that make up this country. The question is, does it go far enough? And one thing that the United States has had trouble with in the past, and you'll see this as an underlying theme in my conversation today, is that, in its incorporation of other states into the Union, those states really only came from the original 13 colonies. They were all added due to elements of those 13 states expanding through a policy of, pretty much imperialism and colonialism, known as manifest destiny, where the original inhabitants of those states were displaced or removed of the other 37 states. Therefore, while serving as a great example of how nations could work together with a unifying body, the United States probably doesn't go far enough in setting a good example for the rest of the world. However, there does seem to be a unifying theme that a unified world government would need, and that's a centralized body made up of the parts, thinking of the House and Senate, which combined makes policies for the whole of the population, which cannot be superseded by the laws of the individual states. While our Constitution allows for states to set many of their own policies, federal law has only continued to strengthen in our nation as the centuries have continued and we've become more of a homogeneous society with shared values and norms. So obviously, the concept of a peaceful community of nations has been proposed as far back as 1705. So we're looking, after the creation of the United States, the idea of different countries combining together. That was Immanuel Kant. He said, in his perpetual piece of philosophical sketch, he outlined the idea of a League of Nations to control conflict and promote peace between states. He argued for the establishment of a peaceful world community, not in a sense of a global government, but in the hope that each state would declare itself a free state that respects its citizens and welcomes foreign visitors as fellow rational beings, thus promoting peaceful society worldwide. After the Napoleonic era, which saw increasingly global warfare inch closer to reality, then we had a serious call for a League of Nations. And perhaps most famously was President Theodore Roosevelt, who called for an actual League of States, stating that during the acceptance, and he actually stated this during the acceptance of his Nobel Prize. He said, it would be a masterstroke if those great powers, honestly bent on peace, would form a League of Peace. And before World War I, there were actual attempts to create a type of body known as the Interparliamentary Union, or the IPU, which actually was created in 1889 and actually still exists today. So the first one that was actually really created is still around. It was founded to resolve conflicts, and mostly today represents 178 nations who all claim they will submit the proposals inside the IPU to their respective parliaments to be adopted into their own countries. So it is out of these democratic movements that swept colonies and wars that became increasingly international, such as the Napoleonic Wars. All of these things were combining together. And when we got to the idea of before World War I, these countries were combining for common defense, and then they were starting to yearn for, there was a growing yearning for an international governing body. However, that didn't really come into fruition until conflicts happen. We're not as preventive as a species as we probably should be. So there was a conflict that happened, the First World War, and it was so bad that there was a growing list of political alliances where countries banded together for mutual defense, and this led to many of the countries getting involved in the war, which everyone knows about World War I. Because of the global nature of that war, there was a call to establish a governing body to prevent future wars And this actually began while World War I was still going on. So it happened between 1915 and 1916. Intellectuals from the United States and the British Empire working together, and it was officially created in 1919. As we know, there was a lot of reasons the League of Nations failed, one of these being the optional participation and the fact that one of the main drafters of the League of Nations, the United States, never actually joined. So the League also had major issues, such as issues with neutrality, making them wildly ineffectual. They were considered as a league of victors, most of whom ruled the council from World War I to its ending. And collective security issues, pacifism, all of that led to the end of the League of Nations. Its downfall was actually widely contributed to its neutrality. And there's a famous quote from Mussolini who said that, when Italy did something they said something, but he said, you're a bunch of mice fighting with eagles. It's the kind of thing where that was the League of Nations. While it did do sexual, it negotiated trade and border disputes and established some international norms. It just was not enough to prevent the outbreak of World War II. And then, obviously, we know after World War II, what came into existence? The United Nations. The League of Nations only had about 42 members, and at the end, about 4. The UN now has 193 member states, with many different bodies and organizations. To best sum up the UN, though, there was a quote by the president of Amnesty International, Margaret Wang, who said, "The UN is like your conscience. It can't make you do the right thing, but it can help you make the right decision." And that's the UN in a nutshell. While it's better than the League of Nations, it still has many of the same issues that the League of Nations had. Namely, all member nations volunteer to be there, and no resolution passed by its members are required to be held into law by the member countries. While there are some penalties that exist for members who fail to do what the international world order asks, there are several permanent members in the council that can veto policies that go against their wishes. This leads to many items that are important to most countries not being approved in these councils. Since I think 1993, the United States has vetoed 16 Security Council issues, a lot of them dealing with Israel and Palestine, because most of the world says, this is wrong, but the United States is allied with Israel. And then there's been a lot of vetoing on the parts of Russia and most recently China because of their conflict with the West. So, it's actually led to a lot of ineffectuality. So the charter does not allow the General Assembly to act because of a veto. International peace and security are threatened, but in reality, it's rarely done. So, the General Assembly does have the power, but they don't ever really use it. And that's when we get into conflicts like, Syria and North Korea, nuclear proliferation. I mean, the UN's been around since all of this nuclear proliferation and has done nothing. So obviously, that's a huge issue. We could go into the European Union, which I actually want to end on the European Union because I think that is a body that is getting towards the right way if you're thinking about wanting to do a world government in a way. So, the European Union, it's been around for, I think a couple of decades now. One thing that they've done is they've strengthened as a group. They represent about 530 million people. So that's a good number of people. What they do is they have, a lot of the member states have the same monetary policies. They have governing bodies. They have way to impose penalties on people who don't do what they agree with and what they vote on. It's still a bureaucratic nightmare in the fact that the laws that they pass has to go through 3 different bodies before they actually become quote unquote law. There's a reason the UK left, and the option is that you can still leave. We found out that you couldn't really leave the Union in the Civil War in the United States, but you can leave the European Union. And while it is a good trade bloc and it represents the interests of its people and, what it does, it allows for the trade of information and ideas very easily and workers from different parts of it. I mean, transportation is a breeze in most of the European Union. It still doesn't do quite enough of what we would consider a world government should do if we were looking at a world government. The problem is, will there ever be a world government, and should there ever be a world government? And that's a question I'm going to pose to you, Chris. And all of this down to that. But tell me your thoughts about all this. I was giving all the history, but tell me what your thoughts are on should there be a world government? What do you think of these organizations and so forth?
I mean, I'm a hippie, so I don't understand borders and flags and patriotism and all that sort of stuff because I think I'm Earth, right? I'm on Earth,
Mm-hmm.
and there's no different races. There's the human race, right? So there's a little bit of that happening. But obviously, we're built into the system of of borders and a globe and power and tribes. I think that's something it's going to be a hard human aspect to pull away from us. I think what's interesting is this is beyond just the League of Nations, United Nations, European Union. We have to think about other organizations. We have to think about OPEC. We have to think about NAFTA. We have to think about, I think, ASEAN is the Asian group. There's other
the League of Arab States,
right? The League of Arab States, the African states. What you see, there's conglomerations that are not only regional but also economically enhanced. One, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which is a tie that binds China, Russia, and Iran, which is particularly interesting when you think about them versus NATO. So I think it's not just how people come together to promote capabilities. I think it's how people come together to thwart prices or continue monopolization or continue to ensure that their countries and the regional countries around them may be that much more important. And what's interesting now is we're sort of having the United States pull back and go isolationist a little bit in the era that is Trump. And during the same era, you have other countries coming and getting tighter and leading on their edge. So you see China taking the lead. You see a lot more multipolar worlds that I think Vladimir Putin would like to see. And you see sort of a lot of people maybe even going their own way, which is particularly interesting. So you might have a little bit back to the future. We're thinking back to the 16, 17, 1800s when we had this multipolar world. And while we did a pretty good job during the 20th century of bringing that multipolar world back together, especially following two gigantic world wars that devastated folks. I think from an economic basis, we're doing the same sort of monetary alignments that we were doing during that same time. So still acting independently, yet forming alliances because it's going to benefit you economically or XYZ reason. Do I have something in my heart that wants us to come together globally? Yes, absolutely. I think the one thing that even Ronald Reagan said, right, the one way to get people to come together to have an aliens attack us, because we'd be like, oh, geez, it's not the race or not this country that's important, it's the human race. I don't think we're there. I don't, even if we were to think about the spiral dynamics and what it would take for us to get to peace and harmony, we're too set in a lot of beliefs. I think the economies of the world is still set from individual states. I even think that we're even forgetting that the biggest states are actually not states themselves, the companies. When Exxon Mobil has the same economic output as Saudi Arabia, or when Amazon has a larger economic viability than, let's say, France, what do states even matter when the world end game is the economy? So I think in some ways we're getting further and further away from a unified government ideal. And I'm not saying I actually agree with that. I do agree with a lot of the things that the European Union is doing. And I think the European Union actually is leading in a lot of these problems, when it comes to things like data privacy, when it comes to the proper regulation of environment, when it comes to the proper regulations of food, and even in the distribution of safety nets that are going to be important that we've been discussing. So I think there's something we all could learn, but do I think that we're getting closer to the one world government that's in my heart? If anything, I think we're stuck in the mud, and we might even be retreating, that much further.
Well, and this is part of the reason why I brought that up, is because I fear that our next steps are we're going to have another world war, and then we're going to have to finally realize, oh, we need to do something, because the UN is, I hate to say it, is a joke. It doesn't have a standing military. It can't enforce really what it says and what it wants. The Secretary General, who holds the position for 10 years, has a very loosely defined job. Right now we're in a period of polarization, like you were saying. Like, the United States, I think we're kind of having a little bit of maybe our midlife crisis, and that's why we're acting like a rebel right now. But we're trying to end all these institutions and these international institutions because, I'm obviously the person that we've elected, but one thing that I see is that, a lot of these institutions are ineffectual and they're being used against us and they're being used against the world order. And, I'm afraid that what's going to happen is we're going to have a battle between dictatorships and autocracy versus democratic ideals. I don't think there's going to be another world war in Europe. I think Europe really has shown through 2 world wars now that they can work together, and they are working together, and they realize the error of their ways. But when it comes to the rest of the world, I'm very concerned. And I think that, right now with our international institutions, that, the UN is essentially a bigger, better version of the League of Nations. And what happened with the League of Nations? It led to another war. I mean, it's led by the same people who became victors in World War II. Countries like India, countries since World War II who have become very powerful states aren't allowed on the permanent to be permanent members on the Security Council because politics. And when you have a nation of over 1 billion people who cannot, who aren't correctly represented, that's a serious issue, and that's going to lead to resentment, and that's going to lead to all of this from the United States and colonialism and imperialism. All of that has led to where we are now, and we are now facing the consequences of that. And we have not done enough to combat it, and that's what I'm afraid of, man.
Want some money?
Okay, so for FizBiz today, by the way, I'm doing FizBiz this week, which is weird.
FizBiz!
FizBiz! No, that's great. And what is it we're supposed to do? Disclaimer, right? So please, I don't know, and you do this better than me. What's the disclaimer? What are we supposed to say? I don't care. Actually, you know what? For my FizBiz, do whatever you want. Listen to everything that I say. Invest in anything that you want. And if you fail, it's your own fault. So no, I'm just kidding, guys. Be careful out there. It's a tough economy, but we're gonna try to hook you guys up with some companies that we think would be helpful. So I did take a look at robots, right? I think we haven't talked about robots in a while. I was seeing a lot of robots in the news. I thought I might bring them up, and then maybe we'll be able to put some robot names for some companies that might be helpful. So one thing that sort of kicked me off of this was that I was reading this in the Digital Journal that Ford was introducing exosuits into 15 factories. So the exosuits essentially are these ESCO vests that allow them they're sort of semi-robotic devices, and allows them to wrap around the upper part of the body and assist whenever it comes to them lifting or reaching for objects overhead. It's sort of powered, and it's wearable, and it involves machines along with the systems of electric motors, pneumatics, levers, hydraulics. And essentially, when I think about it, it reminds me of Alien, the Alien movie, right, where you're using that exosuit to kill the other alien. And I've seen prototypes of this, but it looks like it's just going out. So while this is just a vest, you can just imagine that in the future there'll be larger and larger robotic exoskeletons that could be used. And I thought, oh wow, that was particularly interesting. And you see this sort of happening all over the private landscape. There are private companies that are doing their own investments in their own robotics to sort of find the edge. One I saw one, Rio Tinto. So Rio Tinto is the second largest miner in the world, and they have now a train. They have a robot train that snakes in the Western Australia outback. It's completely driverless, and it allows them to carry a cargo of 28,000 metric tons. And they're going to have as many as 200 of these things operating by the end of the year. All driverless, and all allowing for them to just do a better bottom line. So that's pretty fantastic for them. I uncovered a weed killing AI robot that uses less herbicides. So it's a smart weed killing robot designed by a company called Echo Robotics. It's solar powered too, so it can work up to 12 hours detecting and destroying weeds all at the same time. Which is pretty fantastic. I saw a bipedal complex robot made by Kalashnikov, so the world famous machine gun. It was almost like Ed 209 or the Star Wars walker, right? That the walker that they had on the ice planet Hoth. So these are just the concepts, but it just shows the initial thoughts behind killer robots. And that was another thing that I looked into as well, right? There's a lot of talk around killer robots being banned by both the United States, actually in Russia during the UN meeting. And there's been discussions and deliberations on how to deal with these autonomous weapons and who can gain advantage by certain things. I think in some ways this debate is going to be similar to the way we debated machine gun and chemical weapon technology around the turn of the 20th century. So there's just been a lot of private robots thoughts just generally in the news. And there's been some both positive and negative impacts of this as well. I know the NHS, the National Health System in the UK, they are putting in a new robotic surgery system called the Versius system, which rivals actually the Da Vinci system, is something that we use in America. And so 70 hospitals in the United Kingdom are going to start using Versius, which has independent modular arms, which are quick and easy to set up. The company behind that is CMR Surgical, and they believe that these types of robots are more flexible and versatile than the existing Da Vinci systems, allowing for a wider range of operations. I'm sure you've maybe seen this before, where it's a sort of a hanging system, and it allows the doctor to do automated things. The doctor essentially uses a joystick and a 3D screen. They can do everything from laparoscopic keyhole surgery, which you need small incisions and specific instruments to do this, and it's sort of takes the impossible nature of suturing at these microscopic and nanoscopic levels, and really helps folks. And then, of course, there is the negative aspects when it comes to robotics. So, I was just reading about some of the robot farming. So we're just talking about the robot weed issues, right? But there are robot farming. There's a 7-year pilot currently happening in the Jiangsu province, where unmanned tractors, pesticides, and rice planters in China are going to be implemented. So right now there's a bunch of unproductive polluting farms all over China, and a part of China's modernization is to just go in there like China does and put technology behind it. And unfortunately, what they see is that there's 250 million farmers who live in these, while they may be middling farms. I mean, they're productive for the people on them. So this is a real issue that they see, that while there is a true productive nature behind this, China may be in trouble when it comes to being able to keep their society moving, because they're going to eliminate jobs, like we're always saying, is the troubling part when it comes to this. And this is already happening. These sorts of the automated farming is already a part of things. U.S. farms, they use robotic milking machines. There's 2,000 of them located around the country. They're all over Europe as well. Robots in farming. It really just technology integration in farming is when it came to the tractor, right, versus the plow. These are things that people always thought were troubling for sure. But I think it's just interesting to note both the positive and negative aspects and how it can help the society. So let's just talk briefly. Then we'll get into your thoughts, because I know you're in the IoT space. You're all about robots, so I want to get your thoughts around this as well. So let's pull out a couple of these names. One, iRobot. I know you're a big fan of the Roomba and the Brava mopping robots. It's one of the leading ones. Everybody knows about that one. That's an easy one, definitely, to come up with. Gray Orange they design robotic systems for logistics and supply management. So you're thinking those robots, those warehouse automation ones, the fulfillment centers that you see in Amazon. That does this. Gray Orange, their headquarters in Singapore, but they extend really all over the world. So they're especially big overseas. Epson, they not only kill you with printer cartridge costs, but they're also really big when it comes to Scare robots and PC-based controllers. So that's really interesting. Rethink Robotics. I think you may have seen the Baxter. It's the one that you could move and it could do things like, fill in boxes right on your own small assembly line. Baxter, I think it's like 24,000 or something like that. And we discussed it on the show, and they're refining that more and more. But that's done by Rethink Robots. Google, right? So Alphabet, they are all in the robotics market, and I think when you think of Google, you think of Waymo, right? The autonomous car, and I think we can even discuss autonomous cars as a little bit of having to do with robotics. DJI, the drone, is a robot, and DJI is one of the leaders when it comes to drone technology. Of course, that's headquartered in Shenzhen province in China. Locust Robots, again, another warehouse automation robot, and just all sorts of others. I think let me bring up a couple others that I think would be helpful. Bosch, all right. So their United States automated lawn mowing, which is going to be helpful for me. I got to actually mow my lawn tomorrow, but they're hoping to not only do automated lawn mowing, automated motoring just in general, but they're definitely going to get into the autonomous car business as well. Additionally, you have companies like the Accuray, which goes right back to those robotic surgery robots. So they have something called the Cyber Knife System, which is helpful for tumors and robotic accuracy to hit unhealthy tissue with beams of radiation instead of bathing the entire subject body. And it's in more than 100,000 patients later, the new CyberKnife M6 series deployed last year is even better. It utilizes shaped beams that conform to specific contours of the tumors. So it's really exact, cancer lasers, which allow for, the better of society. And of course, when we were just talking about the weaponry behind it, but Northrop Grumman, they're designing the big drones of the future. And I think we're going to think of Northrop Grumman's X-47 robot plane. It made history last May when it was the first unmanned vehicle to be launched from a catapult from a carrier. So I think the future of military robots, military drones is exceptionally important. So I think one of the headlines that I was reading as I was going through this was it said, "These are the drones you're looking for." The homage to Star Wars, when they said these aren't the drones you're looking for. I think that's where we're at. I think we're in a space where robotics is here to stay. We're not anywhere near the T1000 by any means. But I think you're going to see it as a real positive thing for companies, for your personal home usage, and even in horrible things like war.
Yeah, I agree, man. I think that if you look at what's been going on with military as one aspect that you were just point blank saying is that the military is investing all of this, and what's the robotics research has traditionally, at least in the past couple of years, really fallen behind artificial intelligence research. And now it seems like robotics is finally catching up to artificial intelligence, because obviously when you don't have an artificial intelligence and it's something that's smart enough to do all these different tasks, then it becomes really difficult to even create a robot to do a simple task. So, you look at, you're right, a robot was one of the first ones can mop your floor, but now they've got things that, if you're looking at investing in companies, obviously the tech companies that are really good. Anything. So what's funny is I have a series of stocks that I call my war stocks, and they're military companies. And what's funny is that these military companies like Northrop Grumman, these companies that create devices for war, are doing really well. And one thing that you and I talked about is before our president was elected, President Trump, I actually invested in these because I had a feeling he was going to be elected, and they went up through the roof because obviously when you have a Republican in office, they tend to spend more on the military. And what's interesting is that you're right, robotics is the future of war. We're going to have, we're not going to have piloted planes anymore, because we're going to say, let's just create a non-piloted plane that can control ground. Something like that is it's safer, but then that's the aspect of artificial intelligence. And what if it, kills a person? Same with, automated vehicles. What happened with that lady out in, I think it was California, where she was hit by a driverless vehicle, even though there was a driver in the car. So, that's the kind of thing that, robotics investing is actually something really good to be in right now, because there's so many, like, eventually we're going to have lives full of robots, and everything's going to be, I have an IoT company. I don't make any qualms about that, and you can't invest in it. So there's nothing, there's no type of thing, where people can be like, oh, all right, yeah. So what IoT is becoming. IoT is supposed to be a $5 trillion business by 2020. So it's if you can invest in technology right now, tech that you think is really going to be going to change things in society, you really can't go wrong, because those types of things are going to continue to grow. And if you pick the right one, obviously, and you have to make your own determinations, then it's going to do very well for you in the long run.
No, absolutely. And I think the one thing to look at is not only the robotics companies themselves, but also the private companies like we were discussing, Rio Tinto, Ford, these sorts of play. They're going to want to do their own investments, their own R&D. And I think that's something to pay really close attention to. So not just the iRobots, the Googles of the world, but how are some of the old school companies continuing to innovate in order to save time, save money, find additional revenue, find more efficiencies. And as this drone technology continues, the robot technology continues, I think you're going to see that much more efficient operations. And I think you'll find, that much better returns when it comes to your investment if you pay very close attention to how these companies innovate when it comes to robotics and drones.
All right, great. So for the interview segment of the podcast, we'll be speaking with Yesim Kunter, a recognized play expert with keen understanding of human behavior and ability to create meaningful new experiences, who, as a play futurist, researches and uses steep trends, design, and consumer insights to work in the fields of innovation design with some of the corporate and world leaders, to include leading institutions such as MIT, Tufts, and World and Fortune 500 organizations. Yesim is a educated and trained toy designer with a BFA in toy design from the Fashion Institute of Technology, with experience in interior architecture and environmental design as well, and as a multimedia industrial designer as well. And she's worked with some of the biggest toy brands, to include Toys R Us, Lego, and Hasbro, and has been doing independent consulting on the future of play for the past 6 years. So, Yesim, first and foremost, thank you so much for joining the podcast. This sounds like it's going to be a really fun conversation. I think just to kind of sort of set the table, though, because a lot of people are going to be scratching their head and thinking, what is a play futurist and what do they do? So maybe you can sort of tell a little bit about what you do, what a play futurist actually does, describe that a little bit, and then maybe, kind of tell us a little bit about why you think the future of play is so important.
Okay. I'm first of all, I'm very much excited also to be in this podcast, and so I'll start with the toy design part of it, and then go into the play expertise and the play featuring and what it really means. So I started my journey with being very much excited of understanding, what the playful things are. So when you think about the playful things, it doesn't mean it has to be just a toy, but it can be any kind of object which can kind of provoke playfulness within itself. So I was very much interested in understanding that, and that comes from the interior architecture and understanding the environment and the people's behavior. Then it became my passion became more about understanding children and how children's mind is evolving and what is the brain function and how it is actually going to affect their way of thinking. And then also, of course, it took me to FIT, and then from there to Toys R Us, and then to Lego. But it really started, the featuring part really started with Hasbro. So because Hasbro has 1,600 brands, we had to understand play from all directions. You don't just design it for a child, you design it for adults as well. So you have to understand different kind of generations, different kind of behaviors, especially with the steep trends where the social world, the social, technological, environmental, and economical and political, all of these pieces, how they are actually emerging and what's going on. And when I started at Hasbro, it was 2005. So you can imagine everything was just coming in. The social media and, the interactive screens and everything was just kind of becoming an important piece. So we were very much interested in understanding the technology, the simplest form of technology, really, because in toy industry, really you have to understand what it really means, the cutting edge of technology, but how can it actually become cheaper, especially for the toy industry. So that was very interesting because you can mimic some of the things. Then you have to understand the behavior of people and what does it change, especially if you start with the children, especially with the babies, for example. You really need to understand how they develop and what are these kind of like fundamental things that's going to be necessary for them, so the function. And then you also have to understand the connection between the parents and the children, so it has a different layer in that. And then the grandparents that comes in and their normal daily life. So it's kind of like you have to understand so many different dynamics that kind of goes in. And also on top of it, what are the aspirational point of them? For example, we used to go to not just technology, but you go to, for example, design conferences to understand, for example, how the furniture is actually changing. Laser cutting, all of these like a laser print and all of these things coming in. So what does it really mean in the toy industry and how do you apply it? What does parents need and what does actually children going to need? So you have to think all of these different kind of dimensions and then kind of imagine what you have to do. And I was fascinated about the learning platforms. So that's the reason my connection with MIT Media Lab and the Tufts University is for me to understand what is the future of learning systems are going to be. It's not just one direction, but how does it actually, what do we really want children to become? So in 20 years' time, a child who was born in 2006, in 20 years' time, it's going to 2026. So it's kind of like you really have to understand what are the needs for that period of time. What is the workforce going to need, so that you have to almost develop those kind of tools. That was the futuring part for me.
Wow.
Because you can imagine in toy industry, you can't really, you are most of the time designing for 1 to 2 years time. And because everything changes, it's like a fashion world. But to imagine for 20 years time means you have to think about abstractly. You need to really understand what are the fundamental things going to change, the values, the behaviors, and the expectations of the world, so that you can actually provide those kind of environments.
Yeah.
So
that's
what a Play Futurist does.
That's so that I tell you, this is way more complicated than what I remember in that 1980s movie Big, right? I think that's some of the folks think, oh, I just go and I get a bunch of GI Joes and dump trucks and Barbies and we play with kids and we figure things out. It sounds way more complicated and actually infinitely more interesting. So maybe just broadly, what are some of the things that maybe you did figure out about play when it came to designing all these different things, whether it's a toy, whether it's the technology factors? Were there interesting or maybe novel insights that you picked up from all this research that you did that made you think that not only children but really society is different than you really thought before you became a play futurist?
Great question, because yes, it inspired me totally, especially when you think about when you are designing for babies. It's just so exciting to look at the brain and how it actually kind of evolves from inside to outside. And the other thing was very interesting for me, learning and creativity. What are these two fundamental things? And what is the education system in the world? And what are we doing actually? Are we giving it in the right way? Are we making people to question, or are we making them to memorize stuff? So then I realized our education system is way behind actually, than what it should be, because you are not really questioning, you are actually creating almost standardized way of thinking, which is actually not a great thing, because you want the critical thinkers and you want the creative minds, you want kind of flexible things. And I realized our are actually tools, and the play is fundamental component in that system. That if you can actually give some kind of a space for children to kind of imagine and be curious, then you are actually giving them an environment which they can start to imagine new things. But if you create a playful items which are very much structured, then you are actually killing their imagination, because you are actually giving them completely already made ready information, which is crippling them. That's what I would say. And that was very interesting for me to almost realize. And actually, play is almost like for me, it's kind of like your thinking modeling. So that was like, because you are manipulating when you are giving any kind of play item or playful item, you are manipulating the brain how it's going to be evolving, which is actually, that means you have to be very careful in what you are actually giving them, so that they can actually, I mean, you can never assume that people are going to play with anything you have given them in the way that you imagine, because there's always some kind of a way it's going to be changed in their hand. But you can always give them something which is going to provoke their imagination in the right way. So that's my ambition, I guess. That's what I would say.
Well, sounds like a good ambition. Yeah.
Yeah. So it sounds like you have all this experience working with different toy companies. I have to ask, what is your favorite toy and why? And how does it influence people, and why is that important to you?
My favorite toy is usually the simple toys. So they are kind of the traditional, the ancient toys, I would say. So they are kind of like the ones which is like a spinning top, or the marbles, or for example yo-yos, that you can actually find the surpriseful behavior that comes from the function of the toy. And so it's an object which kind of, so basically it's an object play. That's what I would say. And once you can kind of play with them, then you are going into a complete different world, basically. So that's what I love, because it gives you an imagination provocation, so that you are happy with it, and it kind of changes the way you perceive things.
Well, and then so one thing that I find interesting is that the toy industry is evolving right now when it comes to male and female toys. There was this big movement to give female children the option to play with what was predominantly male toys in like the past 30 years. What is your take on gender neutral toys and the idea of boy or girl toys? Do you think that there is really such a thing as a boy toy or a girl toy?
So that's a great question, because I always see this as a gradation in a way. I think it's really hard. I mean, I can see it. There's a stereotypical way of looking at the boys and girls, and it's very much like almost black and white. And it's almost very dangerous to make that kind of categorization, because every time you make that categorization, you are actually taking some kind of a play opportunity from the other side. So that's the reason I think I'm not suggesting like there's just a boy or a girl kind of play style. Of course there is. It's a gradation of different behaviors and different kind of needs and wants and wishes. So it shouldn't be maybe categorized, but it should be made in the gradation, so that it can actually give some kind of opportunity for any gender or any kind of behavior to be actually picking and finding their own identity. I think that's the crucial thing. We shouldn't almost categorize the identities. That's the danger, probably.
Oh yeah, for sure. So I think we've definitely laid the groundwork right for what a play futurist does, right, or a toy futurist does. That the work that you do, the super actually fun work that you do. I'm really jealous actually, but let's actually get into the future of toys and play. I think Jack and we definitely talk about all sorts of things that could speak on the future of play. Artificial intelligence embedding itself into video game technology, the ideas of augmented and virtual reality, definitely on the technology side, different materials and or types of materials which may affect, how you build a better Nerf football, or how you build a more sustainable Barbie doll, right? For instance. So, just, without maybe sharing any company secrets or anything like that, what are some of the future sort of play and or toys that may be out there on the horizon that can get our parents and maybe even soon to be parents excited?
There are, of course, there's a VR and AR, all of these different kind of like technology related things. But I think we need to look at what are the trends today, what are the problems today, maybe, and how it is kind of going to be evolving in the next 5 to 10 years, and maybe even more. So if I kind of leave the technology on one side, then I have to look at what is kind of being almost missing in our lives. And one of them is, I think, nature. Nature is becoming such a big trend. And it's quite interesting because every time what I see is when there is something missing in our lives, then it becomes a huge trend because there's some kind of like a between them interaction. There's some kind of connection with them. So because nature has been taken away, actually, we kind of put it into a box also. Now it's becoming such an important thing. So we see a lot of forest schools coming in, like teaching children how to climb a tree because most of them are not doing it, and how they can actually create their own nets or like tents, or they can actually climb a rope, or these things are really interesting, and they are kind of are very much in innate nature that we used to do it normally, but now we have to give them as a gift back. So this is becoming more and more important because there is a backlash to the screen time, and especially in play. Most of the parents are kind of becoming a bit scared of using a lot of digital world into the children's world. So there's some kind of questioning going on in that. That's why the nature part is, kind of coming in. But I see this as like almost like a pendulum in a way. So, we were very much excited in the technology being so much in our lives. Now I think we are getting used to it. Now we need to almost put it into balance of how can we incorporate that with our normal natural life and tangibility also. It's kind of like a digitalized information is important, but how do we actually make it into tangibility that it kind of becomes that you can touch it? Because at the end of the day, our hands are the most fundamentally things that we use. And if you don't make the most use of it, what are you doing with that? I'm keep always thinking about like the old dialing, telephones, like how cognitively it's really hard. Like you have to think about the numbers, the sequence of the numbers. You have to pull your hand all the way, dial in. And so as an action, it's a very complicating thing, actually. So as a movement. So how can we bring those kind of important complications to the simplicity, and how can we make that? I think the future needs to go in that direction. Otherwise, we are probably going to forget some of the fundamental natural things, behaviors of ourselves. So that's one important thing I see. The other thing which comes from that, which is driven from that, is the creativity. What does creativity really mean? And how can we actually keep our imagination? So if we are saying that we need to be flexible and divergent thinkers, how can we actually bring those kind of mindsets back to the reality of our life? So every time I give a speech about play and importance of play or philosophy of play, people come back to me and ask me like, how can we be playful people? How can we actually integrate that to our own normal lives? And I'm like feeling almost like in a way, it's kind of like play doctor. It's kind of like, it's I have this problem and I want to be playful now. I'm like, okay, that's really important. That how can we so digital interfaces kind of brought us the playfulness. It kind of reminded us that we can be playful, we can play games, and it's okay to be adults even doing that. So I think that playfulness will come in more into our daily lives in the future because we are going to give the permission to it. And within that, imagination is going to be much more flourish. And now from that, the creativity is going to become even much more powerful, I think. That's how I see it.
Well, I mean, and this actually leads right into, a question that I had on injecting play to other places besides, right, maybe what we would consider the play spectrum, right, the child in us, or the video gamer who comes home from from a hard day's work and opens up Call of Duty, that sort of thing, right? Play is important, but can play also be important in industries? Can play be important in the corporate world? Can play be important in NGOs or even in government? Have you thought about injecting sorts of play scenarios or these sorts of games to help maybe perhaps better a company or even better society?
Yes, actually, right after I was working at Hasbro, I decided to actually start my own independent consultancy. And one thing which came from that was the Play to Innovate brand in a way. And it's all about the play workshops that I can actually start to use it with completely different industries like you said, NGOs and some of these governmental bodies. And it's more about actually creating your mental, like a mental tangible maps basically, and then you can play with them because once you start to create scenarios, and you will know it as futures, it's sometimes it's nice to play with the post-its and then look at it as a what's going on and how it's going to happen. But it's also fun if you can actually create these worlds into reality, and then you start to scenario play them, then you start to see so many different dynamics and connections between the scenarios, and you start to see how it can actually evolve. For example, 2 weeks ago, I was at the education conference in Mallorca, and we were looking at the future of education in 100 years' time, and what does it really mean? So the participants actually created these mental models, and they were all worlds, and I asked them to create like a fantasy world. So once you go into a fantasy world, you are actually kind of expanding your mind, and using those kind of playful way of looking at things actually kind of, you forget your reality, and you are okay and permitted to come up with crazy ideas. But as you know, the crazy ideas sometimes can become realities. And so that's what I've been doing actually in the last 6 years, trying to use play in corporate worlds, and people with has nothing to do with children, but they can actually find their own creativity within that.
Well, and that follows up to the question that I was going to ask you about adult learning. About so my wife's actually an educator. She is in adult learning, and I am an adjunct professor. And one thing that I include in my classes is simulations. And I've never actually thought of it as play, because that's really what it is. You are playing a role, and you are basically assuming a task and coming up with ideas. And I think that's a brilliant way of doing it. I mean, tell us more about your work that you've done with adults when it comes to, like you said, you were talking about education. Tell me more about like what you see, what the role play has with adults, and how you see adults interacting and playing. Because obviously we do it less than children. But how is how is it happening that what exactly are we learning from this, and what types of adult play have you seen?
Actually, it's quite interesting. Every time I put people into play mode, so I call it play mode basically, you give them some kind of like aluminum foil. So the materials usually are very simple materials like aluminum foil, sometimes pastas, but pastas can become really, really messy. So like straws, balloons, so materials which is so unrelated with each other, but they once you put them together, because as a material they are interesting for me. They have different kind of symbolic connection with them. So anyway, every time they see these kind of objects, their face lights up. Even though the people who you think they are very conservative, they will definitely, you can see their eyes are shining actually, because mentally they go directly to the age of 6 or 5 or something like that, between that age, depending on the people, and they start to open up. They start to become much more childlike, not like a childish, but kind of like the childlike mind of a curiosity and the flexibility, and actually even perseverance, because you can fail and you can make some silly mistakes, and that's also okay in that kind of a place. And and their imagination. We actually figured out, especially in education, and we were doing with the service management with Warwick University, the manufacturing group, and there we figured out that the next day when they were doing something much more serious, for example, I don't mean that play is not serious, but as a much systemic ones, their imagination and creativity was so much more open and adaptive. So you can almost see that you are giving them a place which they're probably they are much more connected to their intuition and their emotions. And once they are in emotional state, then they can actually start to see what might happen, the possibilities, and the connections that you wouldn't maybe do it in other way. It becomes easier for some people. And also abstract thinking. I think that's really important. So if you want to go in much more deep in questioning certain areas, you can start to, without having kind of frames, you can actually break those frames and become much more open.
And so I'm also a video gamer, so I'm huge into games. So that's going to be my next question. Is I play board games and I also play video games. Do you find that people who find time to do things like that like are more creative? I mean, what does your research tell you about people who play video games, or because they tend to be in the technology sphere or something like that? Like, what does your research tell you about those types of?
I didn't do it like as a series, like as a special research on video gamers versus or non-video gamers. But what I saw is definitely the people who are much more open to playing different kind of things. They have a much more open mind of looking at the solutions, problems, or kind of trying to see white space opportunities, for example. Usually, I don't put them into game. So what I do is not gamification. I call it more like a playification, because it's much more like a scenario creation and storytelling, and also it's in a bit more role play and object play. But the minute you are actually, and also interestingly, actually, scientific minds are also very much open to playing. Like, for example, the engineers and the people who are questioning, like looking at problems and trying to solve, they tend to have much more playfulness in them. But it's also very hard to make that kind of a direct categorization, because it can vary actually. But you can see, for example, different genders and how they play. Their play behavior is a little bit different than each other, which is nice because they complement each other, I think. But the hardest ones are the ones that they think they know everything. That's what I would say. They think that they have the answers for everything, are the hardest ones to open.
Yeah, doing for sure. And of course, I think going through scenarios that that's hard to get through is definitely tough. And sometimes I don't know. I need to do more scenario stuff. I actually just got a video game device. I may be diving back into those scenario worlds that I'm unsure about. So I'm looking very much forward to that. I want to sort of just change a little bit and talk about a phrase that you may be familiar with, gamification. And I think, for sure, a play futurist definitely plays into, that sort of space, right? So the idea of, creating, point systems that can be embedded not only in games, right, that we play, but also in society at large, or even in companies, or even, just generally in all of our lives. I'm wondering, what you think about the concept of gamification and what it means for society or for companies or just broadly. And also, do you find it as a positive or negative way to interact?
I think gamification is very powerful tool. It's because it does have those kind of like the missions and everything, and the award system, so that you can actually get a lot of people to commit to it. And it's easy because there's a frame, so it becomes easier to follow versus something which is more open and much more like ambiguous in a way. So gamification has been used in so many different ways, like brands to promote themselves, and it becomes easier because it kind of pulls people quicker, especially if it's a very simple tool. Then you can actually start to follow people, and then you can understand their behavior and what they like and what they don't like, and or you can actually use the system in a much more fun way rather than making it this kind of like a strict kind of rule following. So for that reason, I think gamification is a great tool. For my case, I think I mean, if I want to create creativity, I'm much more open to something. There's no frame, basically. So I want people to feel a bit uncomfortable, I have to say, so that they can actually be okay with the uncomfort, so that they can actually leap from that place and then find some kind of a self-confidence trying new things. So I guess that's the difference between the playification when I say it to gamification.
No, sure. So, I guess in all of your many years of, being on the cutting edge, I guess, of play, is there anything that, has really surprised you, both in a positive or negative way, when it comes to, this particular world? I mean, I think it's a foreign world for many people. I think people in society, play is seen as a negative thing, right? Where it takes away from the productive, mechanistic, directing, portion of society where I'm always got to produce. I have to make more money. I have to write another blog post. I have to, write this comment. I have to pay my taxes. And play does none of that, right? Play is actually taking away from my ability to do those things. And, maybe play has lost its way, if you will, in today's society. Just wondering what you think of, I guess, the public's perception of what play is. And also, if you were going to make a stance, make a play for play, if you will, to society, what would you want to tell, the folks of the world about why play is a good thing to do?
Okay. First of all, what I learned in all these years, especially after working for big toy companies and then being out of it, I was surprised to myself even, because although I was so much into being playful and doing things, I was very much surprised to find actually play is so much more deeper than what I was expecting. I mean, for me, it came as it manifested itself as a toy, but it's so much more than that. Especially if you read Huizinga, the Homo Ludens, then you start to see that play actually is the start of the whole, cultures and the rituals. It's the start of the conversations. It's the start of the collaboration. It has so many different layers of importance, I have to say, that if you take it away from you, you almost cripple yourself. You almost actually kill your soul in a way. So I think play is not taken away from us. I think we just don't name it as play in some of the things that we do. For example, the humor, the way that we make jokes, that's already a very playful thing, because you are playing with the words. You are playing with the cultural, simple things that you are actually making fun of it. And also, if you look at, so there are different ways of play. There are so many different layers of play, which is so deep that you almost think that, for me at least, I feel like I'm probably going to work on this all my life. That's it. It's kind of like a deep place, because people start to ask me about like what is play, but from different industries, from beauty, from health, from architecture. Once you start to get those kind of questions, you start to realize actually it lives in every different industry and in every different shape. So that's why I kind of want to bring it to the people that actually the playfulness is inside every day of your life, in any place that you look at. Once you are, and it's so important important for us, especially mentally, to keep ourselves healthy. I think that mindset is so crucial because that's the way we are actually understanding each other. The empathy starts with the playfulness. That's the way we kind of sustain our relationships, because then you are creating some kind of rituals, different kind of way of speaking. That all comes from the playfulness, and then we create the whole the or, organism basically of the world based on this. So it's a very much live thing basically. So that's why I think we really need to understand the importance of play even more, and not underestimate the word of it, because you are right. We kind of put it as a very small, cute thing in a way, that it only stays in the childhood, and then we kind of grow out of the playfulness. But actually, if you really grow out of the playfulness, you are basically taking the whole curiosity of the life that you are having. So that's really important, I think, for that reason.
Absolutely. Oh, go ahead, Jack. I'm sorry.
Oh no, I was just gonna say, you're not learning. Like, if you're not playing, you're not.
Yeah.
That's the honest truth, because curiosity is why we learn.
Yeah.
And
it's not just for even the human beings. I think any living thing you look at and you observe it, even in the plants, you start to see that kind of like the motion of it has this kind of playfulness, because they are trying to figure out how to adapt. That's your way of adapting to the world, and that's your way of evolving, actually. So that's why it's so crucial.
And you know what? I think this conversation was really crucial, and we really do appreciate you joining our show. It's been really fantastic to learn about this world. Is there anything, Yesim, that you want to tell our audience about? Any projects you're working on? Any speeches, books, blog posts, anything at all that you want to share this play with?
Yeah, I am actually kind of preparing my play and the case studies. That's my aim, actually. It's still on progress, and it's still in my mind and putting it together. So that's, hopefully I managed to finish it in a year or something like that. That's what I'm imagining. There are other new projects will be coming up with. There's a new technology ball called Story Ball, which is going to be interesting. It's an augmented audio way of playing with the ball. So I'm excited to be contributing to that project. And also, I am really looking forward to write more about the importance of play. So that's what I will be posting more.
All right. Well, very good. Well, thanks so much, Yesim, for agreeing to join us, and we appreciate it. Let's keep on playing.
Yes, let's do it.
All right. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Bye.